3 years. That's how long Ethan Cole came home to a dark, cold, empty house. 3 years since he buried his wife and forgot how to care whether anything lived or died on his land. He wasn't surviving. He was just waiting. Then one October evening, a woman he'd never met was standing at his stove, cooking supper like she belonged there, and everything he'd locked away started coming loose. Welcome to a channel built around the stories that matter most. Cowboy courage, frontier love, the kindness of strangers, and the quiet miracles that find broken people when they've stopped looking. This story will remind you that healing doesn't knock politely. Sometimes it kicks the door clean off its hinges. Subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today.
Ethan Cole wasn't a man who spooked easy. He'd ridden alone through Apache country with just a water skin and a prayer. He'd dragged a calf from a flash flood with his bare hands in the dead of night. He had stood over his wife's grave in a downpour and didn't let a single tear fall. Not because he wasn't broken, but because there was no one left to share the sorrow with. 3 years he'd lived like that. 3 years of riding out at first light and returning to an empty, dark house. So when he pushed open his own front door that October evening, he saw a young woman standing by his stove. Her eyes were a deep brown, nearly black in the lamplight, and they held something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, but something much older. "My name is Lydia Hart," she said calmly. "And before you go for that gun, you ought to know your supper is just about ready." Ethan just stared. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Ma'am, you are in my house." "I know, using my stove." "Yes, stove. In my—" He looked around the room. The woman had tidied up. The dishes that had sat in the sink for 2 weeks were now clean and stacked neatly. The floorboards had been swept clean of dust, and the blanket on the chair near the fireplace, the one he always left in a heap, was folded. "You cleaned my house." "It needed it," she stated simply, then turned her attention back to the pot on the stove. Ethan just stood there for a good 5 seconds, mouth agape, his rifle halfway in his hands, with absolutely no clue what to do. Coming home that night, he'd expected the usual things: a cold, silent room and maybe a glass of whiskey inside the same 4 walls he'd been staring at since Clara passed. He sure hadn't expected company. "How did you get in here?" he finally managed to ask. "The latch on your back window is busted. I saw it from outside." She looked back at him over her shoulder. "You ought to fix that. Anyone could just walk right in." "Someone did," Ethan said flatly. A faint hint of a smile touched her lips, but it was gone as fast as it came. She took the pot off the stove, placed it on a trivet on the table, and set out a bowl and a spoon as if this was the most normal thing in the world, as if she did this every night. As if a man wasn't standing 10 feet away with his knuckles white and his temper rising. "Sit down," she said. "Eat. Then I will tell you everything." "You will tell me everything right now," Ethan demanded, "before I decide if I'm going to fetch the sheriff." She stopped what she was doing and turned to face him, her hands at her sides. And that is when he saw what he'd missed before. The hem of her dress was tattered, with dried mud caked along the bottom. One of her boots had a tear in the sole that was crudely stitched together with some kind of rough twine. And on her left wrist, just peeking from under her sleeve, he could see the yellowish edge of a bruise that looked to be 4 or 5 days old. Ethan lowered his rifle. He didn't set it down, mind you, but he lowered it. "Explain," he said, his voice low and steady. Lydia Hart pulled out a chair and sat down across from the place she had set for him. She folded her hands on the table. She looked him square in the eye, not with shame, but not with pride either. She just had the plain, honest look of a person who had lost too much to bother with pretending. "I was heading through with a wagon train from Tucson," she began. 3 days ago we tried to cross a wash that flooded in the night. We lost 2 wagons and we lost 1 man." She paused. "I did not have any folks on that train. No kin, no husband. I was on my way to my cousins in New Mexico. But all I have is a town name. I have no money for supplies and no horse. My mule broke its leg in the flood. We had to put her down. She said that last part without blinking, which told Ethan she had already mourned that loss on her own, the way she seemed to handle everything. I walked for 2 days to get to Dry Creek. Once I was in town, the hotel clerk said a room for travelers was 15 cents a night. I do not have 15 cents. Ethan remained silent. The fellow at the feed store mentioned a rancher who lived alone about 4 miles to the east. She kept going. He said the place had been neglected for some years and that the owner did not seem to have much heart for it anymore. So I figured. She paused, and for the first time she looked down at her folded hands. I figured I might offer something of use in return for a couple of nights under a roof. A hot meal, some rooms cleaned up, something worth a trade. You figured you would just help yourself to a stranger's home? Ethan asked. I figured I would check if anyone was home first, she replied. There was not, so I built a fire and I started to cook. I reckoned you would either come home and take my offer, or you would come home and run me off. Either way, you would get a warm meal out of it. Ethan studied her for a long moment. He saw the bruise on her wrist. He saw the stitched-up boot. He saw the way she held her shoulders. Not beaten down, not pleading, just steady, like someone who has already played out every possible outcome of this situation in their head and has made their peace with each one. He sat down in the chair opposite her. 3 days, he said. That is it. She gave a single nod. And you will sleep in the barn. She nodded again. I am not a generous man, he said, wanting to make that perfectly clear. I am not asking for generosity, she answered. I am asking to trade 3 days of labor for 3 nights of shelter. It is a fair exchange. Ethan picked up his spoon and took a bite of stew. He was quiet for a minute. The stew was good. It was better than good. It was thick and seasoned with something he did not recognize. It was the kind of warmth that starts deep in your belly and spreads out, like the first fire on a cold autumn night. He had not tasted anything like it in 3 long years. He did not say that, though. Fine, he said instead. 3 days. She was awake before him the next morning. That was the first thing that took him by surprise. He heard noises from the kitchen before the sun was up. The scrape of a poker in the fireplace, the soft clink of a pot. He lay there in the dark for a moment, and his body did something it had not done in a very long time. It eased up. Not a lot, but a little. By the time he had his boots on and made his way to the kitchen, she already had coffee brewing and was standing by the window looking out at the yard with her arms crossed as if she was reading something in the morning light that he could not quite make out. Morning, she said without turning around. He poured a cup for himself. You always get up this early? On a working ranch, you have to. She turned away from the window. That east fence line of yours, the one that runs along the Dry Creek, you have got about 60 yards of it down. Ethan peered at her over the top of his cup. You walked my fence line before sunrise. She said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I could not sleep anyway. Your hens are not laying because there is a hole in the back wall of the coop. Something has been getting in at night, probably a weasel. The water trough next to the barn has a crack in it, about 4 inches long near the bottom. It is not all the way through yet, but it will be come the first freeze. Ethan put his cup down on the table, very slowly. How long have you been awake? He asked. About 2 hours. She pulled out a chair and sat. I made a list. And she did. She had a list written on a torn piece of brown paper in a neat, careful hand. Fence repairs, coop repairs, the trough, the shingles missing from the south side of the barn roof, a broken latch on the corral gate, and the garden plot behind the house that was choked with weeds. Ethan just stared at the piece of paper. You made a list of every single thing wrong with my ranch, he said. I made a list of what needs doing, she corrected him. There is a difference. He looked up from the paper and met her gaze. Mr. Cole, she said, her voice steady and clear, not mean but not soft either. I do not know what happened to you here. I do not know why this place looks the way it does. It is not my business, and I am not about to ask. But I have been working on ranches since I was 9 years old, and I can see what this land is meant to be. This is good land. It has just been let go. She paused. 3 days is not enough time to fix all of it. but it is enough time to make a start. Ethan sat across from her and thought about what he ought to say. He thought about telling her she was right, that it was none of her business, though she had already said as much herself. He thought about telling her that 3 days meant 3 days, and that was that. He thought about telling her he did not want anything started that he was not going to finish. But what he actually said was, "I will show you where I keep the fencing tools." She worked. She handled that ranch work like she was born to it. That was the part Ethan just could not figure out. The way she moved through the heavy labor had a quiet purpose, reminding him of someone who already knew every single step of a job before she even started. She never asked for a hand, never complained, and she sure did not do what he halfway expected, which was make a big show of her effort just so he would notice. She just worked, like she was doing it for herself. It was like the ranch itself was her boss, not him. He found himself watching her from across the yard that first afternoon. She had a hammer in her hand, driving nails into fence posts with clean, powerful strokes. They were not the clumsy swings of a beginner, but the steady rhythm of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He moseyed on over. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. She did not even look up from the nail. "My daddy's ranch, outside of Flagstaff." Whack! "We had about 200 acres. Ran cattle, sheep for a time." "Had," he repeated. She drove the last nail all the way in, stood up straight, and pushed a stray piece of hair from her face, her eyes already on the long fence line ahead of them. "Had," she confirmed, and just moved on to the next post. Ethan just stood there for a minute. "You want to talk about it?" "No," she said, plain and simple, and kept right on walking. He followed after her. He was not exactly sure why. It was not pity, or at least it was not just pity. It was something else, something deeper. It was that uncomfortable feeling of recognizing a certain kind of quiet he knew from the inside out. "My wife died," he said, 3 years back. Lydia stopped walking. She did not turn around. "I am sorry," she said. "A fever. It came on fast. It went even faster. I was out on a cattle drive 4 days away. By the time I got the word and rode back, it was—" He trailed off. Saying the words never got any easier, no matter how many times he did. There was not much left to come home to. "I kept the ranch going because what else was I going to do, but I reckon I stopped caring about it much." That is when she turned around. She looked right at him for a long moment. "That makes sense," she said, her voice low. He had braced himself for something else, maybe sympathy, or those awkward words people say like, "She is in a better place," or "Time heals all wounds." That always felt more like stones than comfort. But she just said it made sense. And somehow that night she cooked again. She had not asked. She had not said a word about it. He came in from the barn well after dark, and that smell hit him again. This time it was fried eggs and salt pork and biscuits fresh from the oven. It was simple food, but it was hot, and it was ready, and she was already at the table, eating her own plate when he sat down. "You do not have to do this," he told her. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to cook every night. I know that too." She looked up at him. "I like to cook. It gives me something to do in the evenings." She paused for a moment. "And you look like a man who has not had a real meal in a lot longer than 3 days." He did not have an answer for that. He just ate. The quiet between them was strange. It was not a bad quiet exactly, but it felt heavy, like the air right before a big thunderstorm. It felt like they were both aware of something building that neither one of them had put a name to yet. "Tell me about the land," she said after a bit. "What it was like before when you first got here." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because the way a man talks about his land before things went wrong tells you what it could be again," she said. Something inside Ethan's chest shifted. It was an uncomfortable feeling, but it was warm, too. He looked down at his plate. "There was a creek that ran all year round along the north border," he said, slowly. "Not anymore, mostly, but it used to. Clara planted apple trees alongside it. 4 of them. I do not know if they are still alive. I have not walked up that way in... He stopped, just looking out the window into the dark for a while. Lydia did not say a thing. The south pasture had good grass, he said, before the dry years came. It could again, probably, if it was managed right. He paused. I had 12 head of cattle when I first built this place. I'm down to 4 now. Lost some to the drought. Sold some when I needed the cash. I could not bring myself to care enough to build the herd back up. But you care now, she said quietly. A little. He looked at her, a sharp look in his eye. What makes you say that? Because you are talking about it like it is happening right now, she said. Like it is still real. Ethan just stared at her. He wanted to say something to shut her down, something that would put his walls right back up where they belonged. Instead, all he felt was seen, like he was standing in a wide-open field with nowhere to hide. He cleared his throat, stood up, and pushed his chair back. I will fix the latch on the corral gate before bed, he said, and then he walked out. On the morning of the second day, everything changed. He was in the barn when he heard hoofbeats coming up the drive, coming hard and fast, not the easy pace of a neighbor just dropping by. He stepped outside to see a rider coming in at a full gallop, pulling his horse up short in a cloud of dust. It was Tom Briggs, who ran the small spread about 2 miles south. Tom's face looked all wrong. It was pale around the edges. Ethan, he said, his voice wound tight. You hear what happened in town last night? I have not been to town, Ethan said. Jed Holloway's place. Tom leaned down from his saddle. Somebody served him papers yesterday afternoon. The county marshal came out and everything. Says he owes back debt on his land title. Some kind of banking claim from 5 years back he never even knew about. They gave him 30 days to settle up or get out. Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. That is not right. Jed has had that land since 1879. Tom said, I know. Everybody knows. But the papers look legal. Jed showed them to a lawyer in town, and the man could not find a clear reason to fight them. Tom glanced toward the house. He noticed Lydia standing in the doorway, and his eyes shot back to Ethan, full of questions. She is working here for a few days, Ethan said, cutting the question off. What else? Word is there is a man in town. Came in 2 days ago, staying at the hotel. Name of Victor Hale. Tom said the name like it tasted sour. He has got men with him, 3 or 4 at least. And he has been buying drinks at the saloon, asking questions about who owns what land in the county, what the water rights are like, and where the railroad is planning to come through. He paused. He is a speculator, Ethan. The land grab kind. And Jed's place is just the first one. Ethan was quiet for a moment. What is Jed going to do? What can he do? He has got a wife and 2 kids. He does not have the money to fight it in a courtroom. Tom just shook his head. I am writing to warn whoever I can today. I figured you should know since your land is worth something, sitting right where it does between the 2 water sources. Ethan looked across his yard at the fence line they had just repaired yesterday. He looked at the garden plot Lydia had already started to clear, turning over the dead soil with a kind of purpose that made the whole idea of planting something there suddenly feel possible. I hear you, he said. Thank you, Tom. Tom turned his horse and rode back down the drive. Ethan stood there in the yard. He heard footsteps come up behind him. He did not turn around. You heard all that? He said. Yes, said Lydia. Victor Hale, he said the name out loud. He felt her go completely rigid behind him. He turned. Her face had changed. Whatever careful quiet she kept there, whatever wall she had been holding up, was gone. In its place was something hard and raw and old, like a scar that had just been torn open. You know that name, Ethan said. It was not a question. Her jaw was clenched tight. Her eyes were looking somewhere far away, past him, past the yard, past the fence line. Yes, she said. Her voice was flat, controlled. The kind of control that comes from walking through fire and learning to live right next to the heat. I know that name. The silence stretched out between them. Tell me, Ethan said. She looked at him then, and for the first time since she had shown up at his house, Lydia Hart did not look broken. Never broken, but she looked cracked clear through in the way things get when they have survived far too much. Get so brittle you can see the dark, hard middle of it. My father's ranch, she said. The place out past Flagstaff, the one she had told me about before. Victor Hale took it. She laid the whole story out for him right there at the table. She did not give it to him in little bits or choose her words with care. Instead, she spoke with the steady, tired voice of someone reading from a ledger. Someone who had taken all the pieces of a terrible event and packed them into a shape she could manage to carry. Her family had held that land for 11 years. Her father, Daniel Hart, had raised that place up from nothing. It was just dry land and dead soil. The same kind of stubborn emptiness that turns into something real when the right person digs in their heels and refuses to quit. They had cattle, a garden big enough to feed a family, and an orchard that was just beginning to bear fruit. Her mother passed on when Lydia was 16. Her brother went back east looking for work and just never returned. It was only Lydia and her father, and that was plenty. It was their home. Victor Hale showed up in the territory about 2 years ago. He came with money, the kind you get from railroads and land companies. He also came with lawyers and official-looking papers, and men who stood right on the blurry edge of the law, with their hands resting close to their pistols. He bought out the folks who were agreeable to selling, and for the ones who were not, he found different methods. With Daniel Hart, the method was a phony claim of debt. It was connected to a water rights paper her father had signed 15 years prior. A single word had been altered on a document that looked just like the real one, turning what was once an agreement for usage into a claim on the land itself. The forgery was convincing enough for the county judge, who just so happened to get a large sum of money for his re-election campaign, to rule in Hale's favor without much thought. "We were given 2 weeks," Lydia said. "We took it to the territorial court. They threw it out. We went to the federal land office. They told us it would be 6 months before they could look into it, and that we should be gone by then." She paused, staring down at her own hands. "My father would not leave. They sent men over to make him understand." "He's not a fighting man. He did not raise a hand to them. But when you spend 11 years building something with your own 2 hands and someone yanks it out from under you with a piece of paper, well, something inside just shatters." She looked up at him. "He had a stroke," she said. 3 months ago. He's alive. He's staying in Flagstaff with a family who took him in because they were kind. He cannot work now. He cannot talk plain." She let out a long breath through her nose. "That is why I was on that wagon train. I was heading to my cousin's place in New Mexico. I have nothing left in Arizona to stay for." Ethan just sat there across from her, not saying a word. The lamp cast a low glow between them. "And now Victor Hale is here," he said, more to himself than to her. "And now he is here," she confirmed, "doing the exact same thing." He thought about Jed Holloway, and the papers that seemed so official, and the lawyer who could not find any grounds to fight them. He thought of Tom Briggs's face, pale and worried. He thought about his own land, about the North Creek and the South Pasture, and the apple trees he had not walked among in 3 long years. "He will come for my land," Ethan said. "Your land is sitting right between 2 sources of water," she said softly. "In this part of the country, especially in a dry year, that is worth a whole lot more than any railroad. Yes, he will come for it." Ethan pushed himself up from the table. He went over to the window, his back to her, and stood there for a good while, just staring out into the blackness. "What about the people who you said you wanted 3 days from?" She met his eyes without flinching. "Yes, that was what I offered yesterday," he said. "I'm changing the deal." He held her gaze. "You can stay for as long as you have to. In return, you will tell me every single thing you know about Victor Hale, the way he operates, the kind of papers he uses, what he uses against people, and what he is afraid of." Lydia Hart stared at him for a long moment, and Ethan Cole saw something change in her expression. It was not relief, not quite. It was more like the deep stillness of a person who has been leaning into a storm for so long they have forgotten what it is like to stand on firm ground. "All right," she said in a low voice. "All right," he echoed. He turned his attention back to the window. Out there, somewhere in the dark, on the road that connects Dry Creek to whatever town Victor Hale just left, the next piece of this story was already rolling toward them. Ethan Cole did not know what he was going to do about it yet, but for the first time in 3 years, he felt a feeling he never thought he would feel again. He felt like putting up a fight. Ethan got no sleep that night. He sat in the chair beside the cold fireplace long after the lamp had burned itself out, turning the same idea over and over in his mind, the way a person will worry a splinter with their thumb. Not to fix it right away, but just to know its exact position, to feel just how deep it has gone. Victor Hale was in Dry Creek, and Lydia Hart had been running from him for 3 months. He was not sure which of those two facts felt heavier in his gut. By the time the first hint of gray light touched the window, he had settled on one thing for certain. He had to ride into town. He had to see this man for himself. Because Ethan Cole had been around long enough to know that the thing people are scared of is hardly ever as simple as the stories they are told about it. And he needed to understand what he was truly up against before he could decide his next move. He found Lydia already up in the kitchen when he came out. She was just like yesterday, with coffee standing by the window. "I am heading into town," he said. She turned around. Her eyes were clear, which told him she had not gotten much sleep either. "I need you to stay here," she started to speak. "Not because I am trying to protect you," he said, cutting off any protest before it could start. "It is because if Victor Hale has his people in this town and one of them recognizes your face, you will lose any upper hand you have before we even figure out what that hand is." He looked her straight in the eye. "Last night, you told me how he operates. He gathers his facts before he makes a move. Well, so do I." She closed her mouth, considered it for a second, and gave a single nod. "What are you going to be looking for?" she asked. "I want to see those papers he gave to Jed Holloway," Ethan replied. "And I want to look this man square in the eye." She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "He will be polite. That is the first thing you have to know. He is not what you might be thinking. He is well-dressed, speaks proper, and he will shake your hand and look you right in the face. You will walk away from him thinking, he seems like a man you can reason with." She paused. "That is his trick. He makes you feel like whatever awful thing is about to happen is somehow perfectly reasonable." Ethan picked up his coffee cup and drank it while standing. "I have dealt with reasonable men before." "Not like this one," she said, her voice low. He looked at her. "When he came to our home," she said, "he sat right down at our table. My father offered him coffee and he took it. And he sat right there and said to my father, he said, 'Mr. Hart, I want you to know that I have a great deal of respect for what you have built here. That is why I am giving you this chance to settle things before they get unpleasant.'" And my father shook his hand. Her jaw clenched. A man who gets you to shake his hand while he is in the middle of robbing you blind is the most dangerous kind of man there is. The kitchen was deathly quiet. "Watch his hands," she said. "He touches things. He picks them up, turns them over in his fingers, and then sets them back down. He does it while he is talking to you, so you end up watching his hands and not his face. He does it on purpose." Ethan put his cup down. "You have thought about him a great deal." "Every single day for 3 months," she said plainly. "When you lose everything you have to one person, you learn them inside and out, whether you want to or not." He took his hat from the hook by the door, then paused. "You said he faked the document, the one for the water rights." He turned to face her. "Do you still have the original or anything at all that proves it was a forgery?" A look passed over her face. It was not quite hope, and it was not quite pain. It was somewhere in that space between the two. "My father kept it," she said, "in a locked box under the floorboards in the bedroom. When they forced us out, I went back for it." She stopped for a beat. The box was gone. Ethan took that in. He had his men take it. Before we even filed the appeal, she said. He was thorough. Ethan put on his hat and stepped out into the morning light. Dry Creek on a Thursday morning was never a bustling place, but Ethan noticed the change the second he rode in. Something was wrong in Dry Creek. You could feel it in the way folks stood talking in small groups outside the feed store and over by the post office. They leaned in close to each other, with their voices low and worried. It was there in the way Mabel Greer, who ran the dry goods shop, watched him from her window. She did not give him her usual friendly wave. The whole town had tensed up overnight, like a herd of cattle sensing a storm on the wind. They were not running yet, but you could tell they were looking for which way to go. He went to find Jed Holloway first. Jed was sitting at his usual table in the back of the hardware store where he helped out 2 days a week, but he was not working. He just sat there with his hands flat on the table, staring at a piece of paper. He had the look of a man trying to read a language he barely understands. When Ethan walked in, Jed looked up, and for just a second, a flicker of relief crossed his face. Ethan. Jed. Ethan pulled a chair out and sat right across from him. "Can I see it?" Jed slid the document across the old wooden table. Ethan took his time and read it. He was not a lawyer, and he knew it. But he was a man who had seen enough land contracts and deed records to know what a proper claim should look like. He read it through 2 times. He found the part that claimed a debt was tied to a promissory note from 1881. It was supposedly signed by Jed's father when he first filed the deed. "Did your father sign any notes back in 1881? Ethan asked. Jed's face got tight. "My father died in 1879. Ethan looked up from the paper. And there it was. The signature. "Ethan," Jed said, his voice strained, "this is something for a court to decide, and I would need to hire a lawyer." "I do not have money for a lawyer, Ethan." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Who else got served with papers?" "Minnie Calhoun got a notice this morning," Jed said. "It was some kind of environmental claim about her access to water. And I heard they are paying a visit to Pete Reyes this afternoon." He stopped for a moment. "This is not random. He is going after the properties with the best water access first. Anything that is near a natural spring or a creek." Ethan remembered what Lydia had told him. "Your land sits between 2 water sources. Has anyone spoken to this man directly?" He called it an opportunity. That word landed just as heavy as Ethan figured it would. He stood up. "Do not sign a single thing," he said. "Not one thing. Do not even sign to say you received it. Do you understand me?" Jed looked up at him. "You know something about this man?" "I know enough," Ethan said. "I will be in touch." He found Victor Hale at the hotel. It was also the best saloon in town, which was not saying a whole lot. But Hale had clearly made himself at home. He was at a corner table with 2 other men. They sat at odd angles to each other, like men whose main job is to watch the whole room. Hale himself was facing the window, looking over some papers with a coffee cup at his elbow. He looked just like Lydia had described him. He looked like a reasonable man, dressed well, very calm. He had that careful, polished look that only money and patience can buy. He glanced up as Ethan walked in, and he smiled. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "You look like a man with something on his mind." "I am Ethan Cole," Ethan said. "I have land 4 miles east of here." "Ah," Hale set down his papers. "I have been meaning to ride out your way, Mr. Cole. Your property showed up during my research. It is an interesting piece of land, good high ground, 2 natural water sources close by." "My land is not for sale," Ethan said flatly. "Most things are not," Hale said, smooth as anything, until they are. Ethan met the man's gaze for a long moment, and he did just what Lydia had told him to do. He watched the man's face, not his hands. And what he saw there in Victor Hale's eyes was the most dangerous thing a man can possess. It was a kind of patience that had never known defeat. "I will be watching," Ethan said. "Whatever you are doing in this county, I will be watching it." Hale tilted his head just a little. "I would expect nothing less from a man who cares about his land." He paused. He set his coffee cup down very gently on the saucer. I do hope, Mr. Cole, that you are not letting yourself be swayed by outside parties, people who might have their own reasons for how this territory develops. Another pause came, this one softer, with the kind of softness that is a threat not wanting to be called a threat. A man all alone on his land with no family and no allies. He ought to be careful about who he takes advice from. Ethan stood there perfectly still. Careful is a good word, he said. I have always been fond of it. Then he turned and walked out of the saloon. He rode hard on the way back home. It was not because he was scared, or not just because of that. It was because his mind was racing faster than his horse, and he needed the physical act of riding to keep up with his thoughts. Victor Hale had made two things perfectly clear in that short talk. First, he was already making plans to come after Ethan's land, and second, he knew Ethan had not been alone. He rode into the yard and saw Lydia over by the west fence line. She was working with some wire and a tool he did not recognize. He rode his horse straight over to her. She looked up at his face and her hand stopped moving. He knows you are here, Ethan said. She did not look surprised at all. She looked like someone who had been expecting bad news and was now just feeling the heavy weight of being right. What did he say? He never said your name. He did not have to. Ethan swung down from his horse. He warned me about outside parties and their interests, and he looked at me the whole time like a man who already knows something that I do not. Lydia put down the wire tool and stood up straight. He has people in every town. That is his method. He gets to a new place, he buys information, and before anyone has a clue what is happening, he already knows the lay of the land. Who in Dry Creek would have told him about you, Ethan asked. She thought about it for a second. The man at the feed store. He picked up the fencing tool she had, put down. He turned it over in his hands, then gave it back. Show me what you were doing with this, he said. Something in her expression changed. It was small, but it was there. She showed him. They worked there together, side by side, through the whole afternoon without talking much. But this silence was different from the silence of that first day. It was less like two strangers being careful with each other, and more like two people who were past the need for being careful. They just had not decided what would come next. It was Lydia who finally broke the quiet late in the afternoon. They were reinforcing a gate post on the corral. The document he used on my father, she said. There was something else wrong with it, not just the signature. Ethan looked over at her. The notary seal, she said. Every legal paper in this territory gets a specific county seal. It depends on which court processes the document. The seal on our paper was from Maricopa County. But the water rights agreement it was supposed to be about was filed in Yavapai County back in 1871. Any document that changes a Yavapai filing would have to be notarized in Yavapai, not Maricopa. She paused. I did not figure it out until months later when it was already too late. Ethan stood quiet for a moment. If Jed's paper has the same kind of mistake, it might not be the exact same type, she said. He is a careful man. He learns from what worked before and changes what did not. But there will be something wrong with it. There always is with forged papers. You just have to know what to look for. She paused again. The trouble is knowing what to look for and having someone who can testify about it in a court of law are two very different things. Are there people in the territory who can do that? Ethan asked. A land record specialist? Someone who would recognize a forged notary seal or a stamp from the wrong county? Yes, she said. There is a man in Prescott. He used to be a federal land office examiner. His name is Aldridge. She hesitated. But getting to Prescott, convincing him to come all the way out here and building a case before Hale has time to push this through the legal system, that is a matter of weeks at the most and probably less. Then we will move in days, Ethan said. She looked at him, surprised. You are serious? You told me yesterday my land is worth fighting for, he said. You told me Jed Holloway is worth fighting for. You think I rode all the way into town and looked that man in the face just to come home and do nothing at all? There was a pause. You barely know Jed Holloway, she said carefully. No, Ethan said. But I know what it feels like to have land, and then to lose the very thing that made it matter. And I'm not going to stand by and watch that man do to Jed and Minnie Calhoun and Pete Reyes. He stopped and started again, his voice quieter. What someone should have stopped from happening to your father. The still evening air hung between them. Lydia turned back to the gatepost. She drove the last nail in, and it went clean and true. Aldridge, she said again, in Prescott. If anyone can prove the forgery in front of a territorial court, it is him. Could he be reached by wire? Maybe. If the telegraph office in town would be willing to send the message. Write it out tonight, Ethan said. Put down everything you know about the Flagstaff documents, the problem with the seal, the timeline of the signature, everything. I will take it to the telegraph office at first light. She was quiet for a long time. Ethan, she said, and the way she said his name was careful, like she was holding something that might break if she was not gentle. Why are you doing this? You do not even know me. 3 days ago, I was just a stranger in your house. He did not answer right away. Right then. He gathered the tools and started walking toward the barn, and she fell in right alongside him. And they walked like that for a few steps before he spoke. Quiet. He was not looking at her. Last night, you told me that my land is still real, because I talk about it like it is now. Yes. You are still talking about your father's ranch in the present tense, he said. You said it is good land, good orchard, not it was. He swung the barn door open. You are not finished fighting for it either. You have just run out of road to run on. Lydia stopped in the doorway of the barn. And Ethan Cole, who had spent 3 years not giving a damn about much of anything, moved through the lantern light, doing the quiet evening chores of a man who had remembered what it felt like to have a purpose. She watched him for a second. Then she went back inside to write out the telegram. He went to check on her an hour later. She was sitting at the kitchen table. There were 3 pages of neat handwriting laid out in front of her. She had written down everything she could recall about the Flagstaff papers, with a precision and a clarity that both surprised him and, somehow, did not surprise him at all. She looked up as he came into the room. There was a new look on her face, something worn out and fiercely determined all at once. The face of a person who has been carrying something heavy, all alone. For so long they forgot they could ever set it down. Is it enough? He asked her. She looked down at the pages. It is what I have. Then it is enough, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. He went to bed. He lay there in the dark and listened to the wind move across the roof of the cabin he had let fall apart for 3 years. And he thought about Victor Hale's patient eyes, and Jed Holloway's dead father's faked signature, and Lydia Hart writing 3 pages of truth by lamplight at his own kitchen table. And then, somewhere between one thought and the next, the thing he had been waiting for without even knowing it finally came. It was a clear, cold, simple certainty. The kind of thing a man can build a plan on. Victor Hale had been doing this long enough to believe that when you knock people down, they stay down. He was about to find out what happens when they do not. The telegram went out at first light. Ethan rode to town before the feed store opened, before the saloon unlocked its doors, and long before Victor Hale's men had even finished their breakfast. The fellow behind the telegraph counter, a skinny young man named Curtis who seemed to be born in the same green suspenders he wore every day, read Lydia's message not once but twice. His eyebrows nearly crawled right up into his hairline. That is a whole heap of lawyer talk for a rancher, Curtis said, choosing his words mighty carefully. Send it, Ethan told him. Every last word of it. It is going to a federal land examiner over in Prescott. Ethan said it again. Send it, and laid the money down flat on the counter. So Curtis sent it. Ethan rode for home a sight faster than he came in. That feeling of being watched in town with Hale's men camped out on the saloon porch had left a sour taste in his gut. One of them, a big fella in a gray coat with his hat pulled down low, had watched him go into the telegraph office. He watched him come back out, too, with a stare that was not quite a threat, but was meant to feel like one. Ethan had looked right back at him. The man looked away first. It was a small victory, but Ethan took it. By the time he got back, Lydia had the old garden plot about halfway cleared. She had been at it since before sunup, turning over the dead soil with a long-handled pitchfork. She was pulling up the thick, knotted roots from 3 years of being ignored, her bare hands protected only by a scrap of old burlap. She looked up as he rode in. "Did it go through?" she asked. "Every single word," he said. "Now all we can do is wait." She gave a single nod and went right back to wrestling with the earth. He sat his horse for a minute, just watching her work. There was something focused and fierce about it. The way she attacked each root, like it had personally done her family wrong. He understood right then that this was how she handled being scared. She did not sit still with it, she worked it out of her. He swung down and went to fetch a second fork. They worked on that garden plot side by side all morning without saying much. It was the good kind of quiet. The kind you build by working together, not by avoiding each other's eyes. By noon, they had cleared enough ground that you could start to see what it used to be and what it could be again. "This was her garden," Lydia said, more a statement than a question. Ethan stuck the fork into the dirt. "She had tomatoes all along this south side, beans, squash." He trailed off. "I do not know why I let it go to ruin. I reckon I just could not stand to look at it." "That is not hard to understand," Lydia said softly. "No," he said, "but I let it go for too long. 3 years is too long." He stared at the patch of cleared earth. "It is going to take more than just seeds to get a crop this late in the year." "Not tomatoes," she agreed. "Too late for them. But winter squash is different. If you plant it now, in good soil, and give it the right amount of water, you could have something come early November." She knelt down and scooped up a handful of dirt, rubbing it between her fingers. "This soil is not as dead as it looks. There is still some life left in it." She looked up at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Good land always holds on longer than you think it will." He looked at her for a long moment. She was talking about the garden, he was sure of it. But he was also pretty certain she was not only talking about the garden. The answer from Prescott arrived the very next morning. Curtis rode out himself to bring it, which told Ethan that whatever was in that message, it was important enough that the telegraph operator did not want to just sit on it. He handed the folded paper to Ethan on the porch, looking like a man delivering a package he did not understand but knew was mighty valuable. "He is coming. He says he needs the original papers. The ones Hale served on your folks, or copies of the original filing that has a clear county stamp." She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "He says he will come all the way to Dry Creek if we can show him that the forgery matches what he saw down in Maricopa County 2 years ago. Somebody else tried to put up a fight against Hale back then. It did not work out, but this man, Aldridge, he kept all his notes." Lydia was quiet for a good long while. "The papers he served on my father," she said slowly. "I told you that locked box was gone." She stopped, then set the telegram down on the table. "But there was a copy filed with the court. When we first tried to appeal to the territorial court, we had to submit the document as proof." Her voice grew stronger. "The court would have made a record of it. It would not be the original, but it would be a certified court record of the very paper that was used to take our land." Ethan saw what she was getting at. A certified copy from the territorial court is just as good as the real thing in the eyes of the law. And if it has the same fake notary seal— She stopped, taking a slow breath. "That is enough. That is all Aldridge needs to get started." "How do we get our hands on it?" "The Territorial Court Records Office is in Prescott," she said. "I would have to go there myself, request it as a party in the original case." She paused. "Which means leaving here." "Then I will go with you," Ethan said, plain and simple. She gave him that look of hers, the one that sized a man up, halfway between surprise and suspicion. "That is a 2-day ride each way." "I know how far it is to Prescott," he said. "Who will watch the ranch?" "Tom Briggs owes me a favor from 3 years back when I pulled his wagon out of the creek," Ethan said. He will look after the place for 4 days. She did not say anything. Lydia, he said her name, speaking it directly, which he had not done much. She went completely still when she heard it. Victor Hale is already making his moves. Jed Holloway might have 30 days on a piece of paper, but Hale will not wait 30 days to start squeezing the other ranchers. Every single day we sit here and wait for something to happen is another day he is using against us. He held her gaze. We have to move first. She picked the telegram up again, read it one more time, and set it back down. When do we leave? She asked. Tomorrow at dawn, he said. They left before the sun came up. He came back with a pair of boots that were too small for him. They had been Clara's, and they had been sitting in the back of a trunk for 3 years because he had not been able to bring himself to give them away, and he had not been able to look at them either. He set them on the table. Try these on, he said, and walked back outside before she could answer him. When they were loading the horses the next morning, she was wearing them. Neither of them said a word about it. They were about 2 hours out of Dry Creek when Ethan spotted the rider. He had been checking the road behind them ever since they left. He was not obvious about it, not in a way that looked fearful, but with the quiet all-around awareness of a man who knows when things do not feel right. And this rider, about a half-mile back, had kept that exact same distance for 2 solid hours, never getting closer, never falling further behind. Do not turn around, he said in a low voice. Lydia's hands tightened on the reins. How long has he been there? Since the junction just outside of town, he said. Gray coat, big horse. He was on the saloon porch yesterday morning, watching me come out of the telegraph office. One of Hale's men, she said. It was not a question. One of them, he confirmed, his voice steady. Which means Hale knows we are headed somewhere. He just does not know where. He sent this fella to find out. What are we going to do? Ethan thought for a second. He knew the road to Prescott like the back of his hand. He had ridden it more than a dozen times. About 6 miles up ahead, the road split. The main trail went straight on, wide and flat. But there was a smaller trail that cut south through a canyon pass before it met back up with the main road 9 miles later. It was longer and rougher, but those canyon walls would swallow a rider whole in less than a quarter mile. There is a fork in the road up ahead, he said. When I tell you to move, we are going to move fast. How fast? Fast enough that he can't tell which way we went by the time he gets to the fork himself. She shot him a quick look. I can ride. I know you can. No, I mean I can really ride, she said, her voice firm. Do not you dare slow down on my account. Something that looked a lot like a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Then you had better keep up. He kept their pace easy and steady, watching the fork in the road get closer. A mile out. Half a mile. He kept track of the follower's position in the back of his mind. Still the same distance, still being patient, just waiting to see what they would do. 200 yards from the fork, Ethan said, Now. They moved. He did not look back. He heard the thunder of hooves and knew she was right there with him. He felt the ground change beneath them as they hit the canyon trail, and then the rock walls rose up high and swallowed the sky, and then the only sound was the of the horses and the rush of moving fast through that narrow space. He didn't let up for a whole mile. When he finally reined in the horses, they were so deep in the canyon that you couldn't see the main road at all. Lydia came up beside him, catching her breath, her hair tumbling out of its pin. She twisted around in her saddle to look back the way they came. Nothing, she said, letting out a quick, sharp breath. He won't have a clue which way we went. Not for a bit, Ethan said. But it'll be long enough. She turned back around, using one hand to brush the stray hair from her face. You knew this trail. Rode it with Clara before they put the road in, she said. It used to be the only way through, he said, then paused a moment. This'll add about 2 hours to our ride. It's worth it, she declared. Yes, he agreed. They kept on riding. When night fell, they stopped at a little homestead run by a family Ethan knew, a couple by the name of Fisk. They were good folks who'd take in travelers, asking only for a bit of help with the chores come morning. Before breakfast was even on the table, Lydia had already fixed a busted step on the porch, and she did it without anyone asking. Mrs. Fisk watched her with that quiet, knowing look that ranch women give one another when they recognize someone who understands real work. Over supper, Mrs. Fisk looked from one to the other, from Ethan to Lydia, with the kind of plain-spoken manner a woman earns after a long life of seeing things clear. "Are you two hitched?" she asked, straight out. Lydia's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Ethan spoke up. "No, ma'am." Mrs. Fisk just looked at him. "You've been on your own since Clara passed on." "Yes, ma'am," he answered. "That's a long time to be alone," she said simply, and passed him the bread, and that was all she said on the matter. But for a moment after, Ethan could feel Lydia's eyes on him, so he just kept his own gaze fixed on his plate. They rode into Prescott on the afternoon of their second day. The office for the territorial court records was run by a skinny clerk named Marsh. He had the kind of bored look of a fellow who'd spent 30 years putting papers in files he didn't rightly understand, and he'd long since given up on being curious about any of it. Lydia told him what she needed, a certified copy of a document, one submitted as evidence in the Heartland Appeal, Yavapai County, from 1883. Marsh just turned and disappeared into the back rooms without a word. They waited for 20 long minutes. Ethan kept his eyes on the door. Lydia sat with her hands folded proper in her lap, her back straight as a board, and her face gave away nothing at all. And right then he understood something. She'd learned how to wait like that somewhere before. She'd learned to hold herself perfectly still in rooms where other folks were making decisions about her life. Decisions she had no real say in. And he hated that she'd ever had to learn such a thing. Marsh finally came back. He placed a document on the counter. Lydia leaned in, and Ethan watched her face as her eyes scanned the page. He saw exactly what he'd been hoping to see. A sudden sharp focus flared up behind her eyes. "The seal," she said, her voice quiet and tight with control. "Maricopa," Ethan said, reading over her shoulder. "A Yavapai County filing with a Maricopa notary seal." She looked up at Marsh. "Is Mr. Aldridge's office still on Gurley Street?" Marsh blinked. "Yes, ma'am. Third door down past the SA office." She was already moving for the door. Ethan was right behind her. Franklin Aldridge was a man about 60 years old. He had the kind of face that had seen a lot of sun and wind before it settled down behind a desk. He was weathered with sharp eyes, and he had no patience for anyone wasting his time. He listened to every word Lydia said without cutting her off. He looked at that certified copy from the courthouse for a good long while. Then he set it down flat on his desk and said, "I've seen this seal before." Lydia and Ethan both froze, still as statues. "Not this exact paper," Aldridge went on, "but this seal, this very notary stamp. Take a look at the registration number right beneath it. 1147. He opened a desk drawer, pulled out a file, and flipped through it like a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. He laid another paper right in front of them. "This here's from a case down in Maricopa County from 1881. Different piece of land, different county, different trumped-up debt claim, but the very same stamp number." He tapped the paper. "A notary seal number is one of a kind. It's given to one person, and it stays with him for good. This stamp, number 1147, was issued to a notary down in Phoenix. He retired in 1879, and his seal was reported stolen from his belongings after he passed away." He looked up at them. "Victor Hale has been using a dead man's stolen notary seal on his phony documents for at least 4 years." The room was dead silent. Lydia let out her breath in one long, slow sigh. "Can you testify to that in territorial court?" Ethan asked. "Son, I've been waiting 2 years for somebody to bring me enough to testify," Aldridge said, blunt as a hammer. "I had that Maricopa case, but the family gave in before it got to court. Hale offered him just enough cash to make him go away." He closed the folder. If you can get me in front of a territorial judge down in Dry Creek with this document and the one from Maricopa to compare it with, and any other properties he's making a move on right now, I can build a case that'll throw out every single forged document that Seal is on." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Every last one." Ethan looked over at Lydia. She was staring at the document on the desk, and on her face was something he hadn't seen before. It wasn't relief, not just yet, but it was the start of it. It was like seeing the first crack of light from under a door that's been bolted shut for a long, long time. "My father's land," she whispered. "If the document that took his land has that same seal, then the whole legal claim against your father's property was based on fraud," Aldridge said. "And that means the court's ruling can be challenged." He paused again, and his voice was careful, not promising anything that wasn't real. "It won't be simple, and it won't be quick, but it's possible." Lydia just sat with that for a moment. Ethan watched her and kept quiet, because there wasn't a thing he could say that would mean anything in that moment. She slowly sat up straighter and lifted her chin. "When can you make it to Dry Creek?" "Just give me 2 days to get my papers in order," Aldridge said. "I will head out right after. We have to have you there before Hale can push these current claims any further." Ethan told him he has already served the papers. He will be asking for a court date inside of a week. "Then I will be there in 1 day," Aldridge stated, matter of fact. "I will leave tomorrow morning." He rose to his feet and shook Ethan's hand. Then his eyes fell on Lydia, this woman who had come into his office with 3 years of sorrow settled deep in her gaze, and the sharp, focused edge of someone who had memorized every part of the thing that ruined her. He offered his hand to her as well. "Your father built something worth fighting for," he said. "I am sorry it has taken this long for someone to help you do it." Lydia took his hand. She did not trust her own voice to form a reply. They were back on the trail within the hour. Ethan pushed the horses at a hard, relentless pace, knowing they had to get back to Dry Creek before Aldridge, before whatever Hale was plotting in their absence, and before the next piece was played on a board that was now moving much faster. They rode mostly without speaking, but it was a new kind of silence, one filled with forward momentum, with a clear direction. This time it was Lydia who broke the quiet about an hour outside of Prescott. Back in Aldridge's office, she started, "When he mentioned my father's land could be contested." She trailed off, gathering her thoughts. "I need you to understand that I showed up at your ranch because I needed a safe place to stay for 3 nights. That was all." She paused for a moment. "But I stayed because I reckoned I might be some help. Because it was no accident to me when Tom Briggs spoke Victor Hale's name in your yard. None of this has been a complete accident." Ethan rode alongside her for a quiet minute. "You believe you came to my ranch for a purpose," he said. "I believe I wound up in the right spot," she answered carefully. "I am not so sure a person knows their reasons ahead of time." She gave him a sideways look. "Sometimes you just have to keep going until you find a place where the ground feels solid under your feet." He considered that. He thought of his quiet house, the smoke curling from the chimney, and the smell of fresh bread that hit him in the gut like a fist wrapped in a memory. He thought about her writing down a list of every single thing wrong with his ranch and presenting it to him like it was a gift. "Lydia," he said. "Yes?" He kept his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. "I am mighty glad you did not ride off after 3 days." The silence hung between them for a heartbeat. "Me too," she said. They rode on, hard. Miles behind them, Franklin Aldridge was already pulling documents from his files, building the argument that could bring Victor Hale's whole world crashing down on top of him. And up the trail in Dry Creek, Hale himself, ever patient, thorough, and well-practiced in his trade, had no inkling that the woman he had run off her own land in Arizona had spent 3 months forging herself into the very tool of his destruction. He was about to learn. They reached Dry Creek 2 hours before sundown, and knew right away that things had shifted while they were gone. It was not just one thing, it was a collection of little details. The way the main street seemed more constricted than when they left. The way two men Ethan had never seen before stood outside the hotel, still in that way that folks are when their only job is to be seen standing there. Tom Briggs was in the yard when they got to the ranch, perched on the porch steps with his hat in his hands, and his face wearing the same look it had when he came to warn Ethan about Jed Holloway. Pale around the edges, burdened with news he did not want to deliver. Ethan was off his horse before it had even stopped moving. "What is it?" he asked. Tom got to his feet. "Hale made his move while y'all were away. He filed for an emergency hearing day after tomorrow. The county judge is riding in from Tucson." He took a breath. "And that is not the worst of it." Ethan waited. "He served 3 other ranchers yesterday," Tom said. "Pete Reyes, Minnie Calhoun, and Frank Dodd up on the East Ridge." He glanced over at Lydia, who was now standing right at Ethan's shoulder. "And this morning, one of his men rode out here, told me to pass along that Mr. Hale would appreciate the courtesy of a meeting tonight if you are able." A beat. The way he said it, it did not sound much like a request. Ethan felt the muscle in his jaw pulled tight. "What time?" 7 o'clock. At the hotel. Ethan looked at Lydia. She was already working it all out. He could see it on her face, that fast internal arithmetic she did whenever the game changed. "He knows we went to Prescott," she said, in a low voice. "His man might have only followed us to the fork, but he would have sent a rider back either way. Hale would have guessed Prescott and come to his own conclusions. He is pushing the court date forward to cut us off from whatever we brought back with us." Ethan said, "Jed, Pete Reyes, Minnie Calhoun, Frank Dodd. We need to show them what we learned in Prescott, and we need to get them to agree to stand as one in that courtroom." "And I have got to go meet Victor Hale at 7, Ethan said. She stopped and turned to him. "You are actually going to go?" "Yes," he said. "But why?" "Because the single worst thing I can do to a man whose whole game is keeping people off balance," Ethan explained, "is to walk in there looking like I do not have a care in the world." He went by himself, leaving Lydia at the ranch creating a list, which he was starting to see was her way of handling things. The way some folks might pray and others might drink, Lydia Hart made lists. He rode into Dry Creek just as the last of the sunlight bled from the sky. Hale was at the same table in the corner with the same posture, the same patient and reasonable look. But something was just a little off tonight. A faint tension around his eyes, and a tension that was more pointed than before. He had spent 4 days wondering what Ethan went to Prescott to find, and that kind of not knowing did not sit well with a man who was used to having all the answers in advance. "Good evening, Mr. Cole," he motioned toward the chair. "I appreciate you coming." "Your invitation was a hard one to turn down," Ethan replied as he sat. Hale observed him for a long moment. Then he laced his fingers together on the table and decided to get straight to business. "You took a trip to Prescott. A man has to travel," Ethan said. "You paid a visit to the Territorial Court Records Office," Hale stated, "and to Franklin Aldridge." He watched Ethan's expression. "Yes, I have eyes in Prescott, too. I have people in a great many places." He paused. "I know what Aldridge is about. I know what he likely told you. And I want to make sure you understand before this goes a step further that whatever proof he claims to have, it is not nearly as strong as he thinks it is." Ethan remained silent. "He had a notion a couple of years back," Hale went on. "It did not stand up then, and it will not stand up now. And I am here to offer you, truly offer you, as one sensible man to another, a much better way forward than the one you are considering." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded paper, placing it on the table without yet pushing it over. "I am willing to buy your ranch for 140% of its assessed value, cash in hand within the week." He paused. "That is not a figure I throw around lightly." Ethan glanced at the paper. He looked at Hale. "Why my place?" he asked. "Specifically." Hale gave a small smile. "You know the reason. 2 sources of water within a half-mile of your property line. When that railroad finally pushes through this county, and believe me, it will, the rights to that water will be worth 10 times what I'm putting on the table today." He leaned in just a fraction. "I am not trying to take something from you, Mr. Cole. I am trying to offer you a way out of a life that, from the outside looking in, seems to be one you have already checked out of." The table between them felt heavy with silence. Ethan recalled what Lydia had said. "He makes you believe that whatever is about to happen is only logical." He pictured Daniel Hart at his own table, sharing coffee with this man right before he signed away 11 years of his life on a simple handshake. "You put the same deal to the Hart family," Ethan said, back in Flagstaff. A flicker of something went through Hale's expression. It was tiny, and it was quick. "I have done business in many territories." "Daniel Hart," Ethan said again. "Flagstaff, 1883. A water rights deal with a Maricopa notary seal on a Yavapai County paper." He watched Hale's face with that intense focus Lydia had taught him. Not the hands, the face. "Are you going to tell me that seal number 1147 just happened to show up on your Dry Creek papers by sheer luck?" The whole feeling in the room shifted. Hale's composure did not break. It did not shatter, but it did what a solid thing does when the ground beneath it gives way. It held itself together with more purpose. The way a brick wall tries to stay standing when its foundation moves with conscious effort. "I believe," Hale said, his voice very low, "that you ought to be very careful about throwing around claims you cannot prove." "I did not make a claim," Ethan said cheerfully. "I just asked a question." He stood and picked up his hat. "Day after tomorrow in the county court, Franklin Aldridge is going to answer it for everybody." He settled his hat on his head. "Good evening, Mr. Hale." He turned and walked out. Steady, but his heart was pounding a rhythm against his ribs. He made sure none of that showed as he walked out the door and moved across the street to his horse. He rode for home at a good clip. There was still a whole lot of night left and plenty of work that had to be done before the sun came up. By 9 o'clock, they were all gathered in Ethan's kitchen. Jed Holloway had the document Hale served him laid out on the table like it was evidence in a crime, which it was. Pete Reyes, a quiet fella around 40, spoke with care and did not say much, but he heard everything. Minnie Calhoun, who was 62 years old and had run her ranch single-handed for 8 years since her husband passed, sat with her arms folded. Her face said she'd been waiting on an explanation and was fixing to be mighty disappointed if it wasn't a good one. Frank Dodd, whose land on the East Ridge was the biggest of the bunch, showed up looking as tired as a man who'd been called to a meeting without knowing who was in charge. Tom Briggs leaned against the wall, a coffee cup in his hand. Lydia stood at the head of the table. Ethan felt the whole room change the second she began to speak. She did not ask for their trust. She laid the certified court copy on the table. Then she put Aldridge's comparison document right next to it. She walked them all through the seal numbers with the clear, steady precision of a person who had practiced this speech in her mind for months, because she always figured this day would come. "The paper used against my family had notary seal number 1147. She said, 'This is a dead man's stolen seal. Franklin Aldridge has records of it being used down in Maricopa County. Tomorrow he is riding in with those records.' She looked at every single one of them. 'I have to know which of your papers you will let him look over.'" Minnie Calhoun was the first to talk. All of them. She said it in the tone of a woman who'd already made up her mind. "Every last page that man sent to my property." Pete Reyes gave a nod. "Same here." Frank Dodd leaned in, staring at the seal number on the copy. He had that careful way about him of a man who read things twice before he'd ever agree to them. That was a good instinct most any other time, but it had also made him a step slower than this situation needed. "What if that seal is not on my papers?" he asked. "What if he used a different trick for my property?" "Then Aldridge still shows a clear pattern of fraud on 3 out of 4 properties," Lydia said. "That right there casts a shadow on the honesty of all the documents, yours included." She held his gaze. "But I reckon you are going to find the seal. He found a method that worked for him, and he stuck with it. Men like Hale do not change what is already working." Dodd settled back in his chair. "All right," he said. Jed had stayed silent through it all, just looking at the papers on the table. He had the face of a man sitting by the grave of a choice he had not made yet. He finally looked up. "My father's name," he said, "is on that paper. His signature." His voice was raw around the edges. "Even if we come out on top, even if the court dismisses it, that forgery is now part of a legal record somewhere. My father's name attached to a lie. He had to stop. I want it on the record that it is a forgery. Not just that the claim is thrown out. I want it called what it really is." The kitchen got real quiet. "That is what Aldridge's testimony will do," Lydia said, and her voice was softer than it had been during her professional explanation. "He does not just argue against the claim. He names the tool used to make it. He calls the seal fraudulent, and he proves the pattern. Your father's name gets cleared. That is the entire reason for all this." Jed nodded. He looked down at the table. "Good," he said softly. "That is good." Minnie Calhoun reached over and gave his hand one quick pat, then pulled her hand right back. That was the ranch woman's way of giving a long hug. Aldridge said that this changes the whole situation from a civil land argument to possible criminal fraud against a whole group of landowners. He paused. "I want the county marshal sitting in that courtroom tomorrow." "The county marshal?" Ethan said, choosing his words. "He recently took a very large contribution for his office fund from a donor who wishes to remain unknown." Aldridge looked at them. "You figure he is in Hale's pocket?" "I figure we do not know," Lydia said. "And that means we cannot count on him, but we cannot leave him out either. We have to move forward like the hearing is on the level, and build a case so strong that any crooked business becomes harder to cover up than to just deal with." Aldridge watched her for a second. "You have given this a lot of thought." "For 3 months," she said. "Yes?" He glanced at Ethan. "She always like this?" "Pretty much," Ethan said. It was late in the afternoon when Hale made his play. Ethan was out in the barn when Tom Briggs came riding in hot for the second time in 1 week, and by that point the sight of Tom Briggs showing up fast with that look on his face had turned into a signal that things had just gotten worse again. "Hale's men paid a visit to Jed's place," Tom said, without hardly stopping. "About an hour back, 3 of them. They told Jed the court date was moved up to tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. Said the judge had a change of plans and they let him know." Tom's jaw got tight. "They told him the offer to buy his land is good until midnight tonight. After midnight, Hale is pulling the offer off the table and moving ahead with the full force of the law." Midnight. Ethan's mind started racing. A 6 o'clock court hearing meant the judge would make a ruling before Aldridge even got to present his evidence, assuming Hale could rig the order of things. And midnight meant Jed had less than 8 hours to decide. He could take the money and lose his land with something to show for it, or he could stand in a courtroom at dawn with no guarantee of how things would turn out. "Is Jed going to hold firm?" Tom asked. "He will hold," Ethan said. He was already on the move. "I'm just going to make sure he has what he needs to stand strong with." He looked straight at Tom. "Are you in this thing for the long haul?" Tom Briggs was a man who had watched his county get picked apart piece by piece for 2 years, with the quiet unease of someone who just hopes things will sort themselves out. He stood there now with the question hanging on him like a heavy coat, and Ethan watched him make his choice. "All the way," Tom said. Ethan nodded. "Then ride." He found Lydia out in the garden. Of course he did. When things were moving too fast and the pressure was on, she would root herself in the physical work of the land the same way other folks might root themselves in prayer. She heard him approach and looked up before he even spoke. "He moved the hearing," she said. It was not a question. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, he confirmed. She stood up straight, pulling the canvas gloves from her hands. "He's going to try and get rulings on the current claims before Aldridge can bring in the evidence of fraud. If the judge makes even one preliminary ruling on any of the properties before the criminal pattern is laid out, it tangles everything up. Can he do that? Get the judge to hear property claims before hearing evidence about fraud?" "He can sure try," she said, "if the judge is willing to play along." She was already thinking 3 moves down the road. He could see it in her eyes. "We need Aldridge to file a formal motion this very night, demanding that the fraud evidence be entered before any rulings on the properties are made." It has to be sitting in front of that judge before tomorrow morning. That way, there is a paper trail of the request that cannot be swept under the rug. Aldridge is over at the hotel, Ethan said. Then we will go to the hotel, she said. Hale's men are at the hotel. Then we will go to the hotel carefully, she answered. He almost cracked a smile. You are not scared of much, are you? She looked right at him. And just for a second, that composed, forward-moving focus of hers fell away, and he saw what was underneath it all. Not a lack of fear, but the decision to keep going in spite of it. A choice made so many times it had become second nature. I am scared of plenty, she said, her voice low. I am scared my father is not going to get better. I am scared that even if we win tomorrow, the government process for getting his land back is going to take longer than I can stand to think about. She paused. I am scared that I have pulled you into a fight that could cost you every single thing you have left. She held his gaze. I am more scared of that one than all the rest. The evening air was still between them. You did not pull me into anything, he said. I walked in with my own 2 feet. Ethan, Lydia. His voice was quiet and solid, and it left no space for the objection she was about to make. My land is my land, and my fight is my fight. And I decided that the morning I rode into town and looked Victor Hale square in the eye. That had nothing to do with you. He paused. And everything you have done since you showed up at my door. The fence line, the garden, that telegram, those 3 pages of notes you wrote at my kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, none of that is a burden. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She just looked at him for a long moment. The way she was looking at him now, not with the careful sizing up from the first few days, not with the focused professional way she handled the work, but with something open and real, something she had not let him see before because she could not afford to. It hit him somewhere deep in his chest with a force he was not ready for. I understand you, she said. Good, he said. Now let us go find Aldridge. They left through the back, staying clear of the main street, and came around to the hotel's side door, a route Ethan remembered from years ago when he used to deliver grain to the kitchen. Aldridge opened his room door. He was in his shirt sleeves with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He had the look of a man who was expecting just this kind of knock at just this time of night. Ethan laid out the whole situation in 3 quick sentences. Aldridge had his jacket on before Ethan had even finished the third one. I'll write up the motion tonight. I'm going to need the name of the county court clerk. Harold Birch, Lydia said. He gets home by 8. If that motion is in his hands by 9, he has to log it before court starts tomorrow. Aldridge just stared at her for a second. How in the world do you know the court clerk's evening schedule? I asked the hotel cook when we first got here, she said, plain and simple. Aldridge looked over at Ethan. Yeah, Ethan just nodded. All right, Aldridge said. Give me 45 minutes. They waited right there in the hallway. Ethan leaned up against the wall. Lydia sat on a little bench across from the door, her hands in her lap and her eyes closed. He knew by now she wasn't sleeping. She was just thinking, holding her whole body still to do it. After a bit, she spoke without opening her eyes. When this is all over, no matter how it turns out, I want to go back to Flagstaff. He stayed quiet. Not for good, she said, choosing her words with care. Or maybe I don't know yet. But I need to see my father. I need to sit with him and tell him what happened here. And tell him... She trailed off. He needs to know someone fought back. Even if we don't get his land back right away. He needs to know that this wasn't the end of the story. We'll get his land back, Ethan said, his voice low and sure. She opened her eyes and looked right at him. You can't promise that? No, he admitted. But Aldridge can make it possible. And possible is a whole lot more than you had 3 months ago. He paused. It's more than you had 4 days ago. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she closed her eyes again. Yes, she said. It is. Aldridge came out at 8:40 with 3 pages of carefully written legal words. and a look on his face like a man walking into a fight he'd been waiting on for years. They went to Harold Birch's house. Birch answered the door in his house robe, read the motion through 2 times, and to his credit, he didn't say a word about how late it was or the odd situation. He just logged it right into the court record with a timestamp of 8:57. It was official. Whatever Victor Hale's men had cooking up for 6 o'clock in the morning, they were going to walk into a courtroom where a motion demanding to hear fraud evidence first was already on the books. As they were walking back through the dark streets toward their horses, Lydia suddenly stopped. "Listen," she said. Ethan stopped too. Coming from the direction of the hotel were 2 voices, getting louder. One of them belonged to that broad-shouldered man in the gray coat, Hale's watchdog. The other voice was tighter, angrier, and it was someone Ethan didn't recognize. He grabbed Lydia's arm and pulled them both back into the shadows of a building. The man in the gray coat and his partner were standing right outside the hotel's side door, talking in low, urgent voices. Ethan could only catch bits and pieces. He filed something. Aldridge filed something. Hale needs to know tonight. And just like that, the other fella hurried back inside, leaving the gray-coated man standing there, staring down the street with the look of a man who'd just watched his perfect plan start to fall apart at the seams. Ethan and Lydia didn't make a move until he finally went back inside, too. "They know about the motion," Lydia whispered, sound of their own horses breathing hard. "Yes," Ethan said. "What does a man like Hale do when his plan starts to fall to pieces?" He thought about those patient, watchful eyes, that calm, practiced stillness. "I do not know yet," he said. And it was the honest truth. She straightened up beside him. Her shoulder was almost touching his in that narrow passage, and he was suddenly, uncomfortably aware of it. "That is the one thing I do not know about him either," she said. "How he acts when he is not the one pulling all the strings." She paused. "I have a feeling we are about to find out." The night was dead still around them. Tomorrow at 6 o'clock, in the county courthouse of Dry Creek, Arizona, everything they had worked for over the last week was either going to stand strong or crumble to dust. The ranchers would either stand together or they would break under the last-minute pressure Hale was no doubt putting on them at this very moment. Aldridge's proof would be allowed, or it would be thrown out by a judge whose side they could not be sure of. The pattern of 4 identical forged seals would be enough to change everything, or it would not be. Ethan knew the feel of that kind of uncertainty all too well. He had stood on the edge of a cliff like this before. The night they gave him the news about his wife, he was still a long 4 days' ride from his own spread. He always said, "You either face what is coming or you do not." He glanced over at Lydia sitting beside him in the dark. Her eyes were already fixed on the courthouse. "You ought to get some sleep," he told her. "You first," she replied. They both knew it was a lie, that sleep was not going to come for either of them. 6 o'clock rolled in cold and gray. Ethan had not closed his eyes. He figured Lydia had not either, but she walked out of the barn looking composed. She had insisted on the barn again, just like that first night. It was some kind of line she was drawing for herself, and he did not push it. With her hair pinned up and her face set, wearing Clara's boots, she looked like a woman who had decided that no matter what the day brought, she would meet it on her own 2 feet. They did not talk much on the ride into town. Most of the words had been said the night before. What was left between them was something quieter, more solid. It was the kind of understanding that does not need words because it had been forged in the shared burden of a week that felt like a lifetime. The others were waiting at the courthouse when they got there. Jed Holloway was there with his wife, who had come on her own and stood by him, her hand tucked in his arm and her jaw set firm. Pete Reyes was there, and so was Minnie Calhoun, who wore her Sunday best. On her, it was not so much for the occasion as it was a clear statement that she meant business. Frank Dodd had ridden in from East Ridge before the sun was even up. Tom Briggs stood off to the side, his arms crossed as he watched the street. Aldridge was at the door holding his document case and talking with Harold Birch. It turned out Birch had shown up at the courthouse at 5:30 in the morning just to make sure the motion was filed right and proper before anything started. Ethan made a note to himself to thank Birch properly when all this was done and over. Hale showed up at 6:05. He walked in with his 2 men and his lawyer, a skinny fellow from Tucson named Pratt. Pratt carried a briefcase and moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who was used to winning on technicalities. Hale himself looked completely calm, and that was the thing that sent a cold shiver down Ethan's spine. He was composed and patient, like a man who had spent the night rethinking his plan and had come up with a new one. That was the most dangerous version of Victor Hale, not the one you could catch by surprise, but the one who could adapt. The judge was a heavy-set man by the name of Carey, who came out of his chambers at exactly 6:15. He looked over the crowded room with the mild surprise of a man who had been expecting a routine matter and instead found a whole town affair. He read Aldridge's motion first, taking his sweet time with it. Pratt shot up to his feet right away. "Your Honor, this motion is nothing but an attempt to bring in outside issues to a simple property claim." "Have a seat, Mr. Pratt," Judge Carey said, his eyes still glued to the paper. He finished reading, put the motion down, and looked right at Aldridge. "You're the examiner from Prescott?" "Frank Franklin Aldridge, former federal land examiner." "Yes, Your Honor." "And you are ready to testify that the notary seals used in these claims are fraudulent?" "With documentation, Your Honor. I have cross-referenced it across 4 properties in this county and a previous case down in Maricopa County." Pratt was on his feet again. "Your Honor, this is completely out of line. The claims before this court are—" "Mr. Pratt," the judge said, and this time his voice had a different edge to it, something that was not there before. "I have read this motion, and I will admit I was also on the wire this morning with the Federal Land Office in Prescott. They were kind enough to confirm Mr. Aldridge's credentials and his past documentation of this specific notary instrument." A silence fell over the room, heavy as a stone settling at the bottom of a still pond. "This court will hear the evidence of fraud first. You will have a full opportunity to cross-examine. Sit down." Pratt sat. Ethan felt Lydia let out a breath beside him, so quiet he almost missed it. He glanced over at Hale and he saw it, the first real crack. It was not in his composure, not quite, but in the certainty that was always in his eyes. That patient confidence, which had never run into a wall it could not get around, had finally met something it had not planned for. It met Franklin Aldridge, with his 3 years of files, a dead man's stolen seal, and a woman who had fought for this every single day for the last 3 months. Aldridge testified for 40 minutes. He was precise, he was thorough, and he was the kind of witness who tears a case apart, not with emotion, but with plain, unshakable facts. He laid out the registration number. He produced the official record of the original notary's death and the report of the stolen seal. He showed the comparison document from Maricopa County. He walked the judge through each of the 4 claims in Dry Creek. Seal number 1147. 4 times on 4 different properties with 4 different supposed debt papers. Every single one of them depended on a fraudulent notary certification to be considered legal. Pratt came at him hard on cross-examination but got absolutely nowhere. You cannot argue with a stolen seal number in a government ledger. You can only admit that it is there. When Aldridge stepped down, Judge Carey looked at Hale directly for the very first time. "Mr. Hale," he said, "do you have anything you would like to say to the court?" Hale stood up, and Ethan watched something incredible happen. He watched a man who had built a whole empire across territories on the fear and silence of other people stand in a small Arizona courtroom and realize, maybe for the first time, that the ground beneath his feet had just given way. "Your Honor," Hale said, "I acted in good faith based on the legal papers given to me by my counsel. If those papers had a fraudulent notary seal, then I am as much a victim of that fraud as anyone." The judge's voice was flat, without a trace of sympathy. "That same stamp number appeared on documents in Maricopa County 2 years ago, in a case where your name also appeared as the one acquiring the property. I'm not in a mood to accept a good faith argument this morning." He looked to the marshal, who was standing at the back of the room. The marshal wore an expression that said he had been hoping he would not have to make any big decisions today, and now he had one. Marshal Webb, you will want to get in touch with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office before Mr. Hale decides to leave Dry Creek. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Marshal Webb straightened his shoulders and nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Hale stood at his table for about 4 seconds that felt a whole lot longer. Then he slowly sat down, and the patience on his face had turned into something else. It was the particular stillness of a man running all the numbers in his head and coming up with fewer options than he had counted on. Pratt was already leaning in, whispering urgently. Hale did not even look at him. Judge Carey looked out at the room full of ranchers. The property claims filed against Holloway, Reyes, Calhoun, and Dodd are hereby dismissed on the grounds of fraudulent legal instruments, he announced. This court will forward its findings to the Territorial Prosecutor and the Federal Land Office for further action. He paused for a moment. Are there any other matters to bring before this court? Lydia stood up. Every head in the room turned to look at her. Even the judge, who had not looked at her before, now gave her his full attention, like a man who has been watching things unfold and has learned to spot the person at the heart of the storm. Your Honor, she said, and her voice was clear and strong enough to reach every corner of the room. My name is Lydia Hart. My father, Daniel Hart, lost his property in Flagstaff, Arizona, because of a claim that carries this very same notary seal. That fraudulent document is on file with the Yavapai County Territorial Court. I am asking that the court's findings today be officially sent to the Flagstaff Territorial Office as supporting evidence in a challenge to that earlier ruling. The room was dead silent. Pratt started to get up, but Hale put a hand on his arm and stopped him. Judge Carey looked at Lydia for a long, hard moment. Your request is noted and will be entered into the record. Record, he said. The message will be sent. Then he paused. I am truly sorry for what your family went through, Miss Hart. Healing will take some time, but the official record will show the truth of what happened. Lydia finally sat down. Ethan did not look over at her. It was not because he did not want to, but because if he saw her right now with all these folks around, his face would show more than he was willing to make public. He stared down at his own hands instead. The room began to empty out, slow and quiet, the way a place does after something big has ended. People gathered in small bunches, talking in low voices. You could feel the tension breaking in the handshakes, the deep breaths, and even a few short laughs of disbelief. Jed Holloway caught Ethan near the door. He took Ethan's hand in both of his and just stood there for a second, saying more with silence than most men could with words. Your daddy's name is cleared, Ethan told him. Jed's throat tightened. Yes, he managed to say. Yes, it is. Minnie Calhoun hurried by and gave Ethan's arm a firm squeeze without slowing down, which for her was like giving a man a medal. Frank Dodd stopped, looking at him with the honest, sheepish gaze of a man, admitting he took more convincing than he should have. I will ride over to your place next week, he said, about that south pasture fence of yours. I've got some good timber you can use. I will take it, Ethan said. Tom Briggs was the last to leave. He stood next to Ethan and glanced across the room at Lydia, who was speaking quietly with Aldridge. Then he turned his eyes back to Ethan, his face holding that look a man gets when he has a dozen things he could say, but picks the only one that truly matters. She just appeared out of thin air, Tom said. She surely did, Ethan agreed. It was a good thing for all of us that she did. Yes, Ethan said, it surely was. Tom settled his hat on his head and walked out. Hale was gone from Dry Creek before noon. He left with his hired men and his lawyer under the watchful eye of Marshal Webb. Webb had in fact been talking to the territorial prosecutor, and his earlier hesitation about making a choice had hardened into a firm resolve to uphold the law. Hale rode out with the definite air of a man who was far from finished. He was not beaten for good because men with that much money and that many lawyers are seldom ever truly beaten. But he had been stopped, right here in this town, by folks who simply refused to stay beaten themselves. From the yard of the livery stable, Ethan watched him ride away. He did not feel like a victor. What he felt was something quieter, something that would last. It was the same feeling he had at the end of a long cattle drive, when the herd was delivered safe and the job was finally done. Not glory, but completion. He turned and walked back toward Lydia, who was waiting with the horses. She had been watching Hale's departure, too. She looked over as she heard the sound of Ethan's boots. "It is not really over for my father's case," she stated. She said it plainly, without a trace of bitterness, just stating a fact. She was holding on to her composure. "The territorial court process, I know," he said. "It could take months, maybe even longer." "I know that too," he replied. He took the reins of Birch's horse from her, and they started walking the horses toward the road. "Aldridge said he would handle sending the report himself. He is going all the way to Flagstaff to do it." She glanced at him. "When did he tell you that?" "This morning, while you were speaking with Judge Carey." He paused for a moment. "He also said, and this is his legal opinion, not mine, that with the Dry Creek findings now on the record and 4 land claims thrown out, the Flagstaff challenge has a very strong foundation." He emphasized the word strong. Lydia walked quietly beside him for a little while. "Strong," she repeated, as if she were testing the feel of the word to see how much weight it could hold. "Strong," Ethan confirmed. She gave a single, small nod. And then she did something he had never seen her do before. A little private gesture she likely did not even know he saw. She pressed her hand flat against the center of her chest for just a second, like she was making sure her heart was still in its rightful place. He looked away, giving her the moment to herself. They rode toward home at a slow pace. There was no rush anymore, no hard miles that had to be covered before the next bad thing happened. The frantic hurry of the past week had burned itself out and left behind something much calmer, something with room to breathe. "What will you do now?" Ethan asked her. She rode alongside him for a bit before she gave her answer. "I have to go to Flagstaff to see my father, to tell him what happened face to face," she paused, "and to file the official challenge myself with Aldridge's papers. I want to be the one to file it." "When?" he asked. "Soon," she said. "In a week, I expect." He rode on without a word for a while. "You would come back," he said then. The words hung in the air somewhere between a question and a statement. He just let it be, not trying to push it one way or the other. She gave him a sideways look. "The garden will not be ready for at least another month," she said. "Somebody needs to be here for that." He did not smile. He felt something much bigger than a smile growing inside him. It was a feeling he did not have a name for anymore, because it had been missing from his life for 3 years, and he had forgotten what it was like to need it. "The garden," he said. "And the apple trees," she added, her voice a little softer now, the careful control she used like armor starting to gentle at the edges. "You said you have not walked up to the North Creek since Clara planted them. I would like to see if they are still growing." There was a pause. "I would like to see what they have become with no one there to watch over them." Ethan stared down the road ahead. He thought about those apple trees, growing for 3 years with no one to check on them, pushing their roots down deep into the dry earth, surviving longer than anyone would have thought possible. "It is good land, always was. I will take you up there," he said, "when you get back." "All right," she said. The week went by the way weeks do when they are filled with plain, everyday tasks. It seemed to go by in a flash, and you could only see the real shape of it when you looked back. Lydia wrote 3 more letters. 2 went to Aldridge and 1 to the family in Flagstaff who was caring for her father, letting them know how things had changed and what was coming next. She spent 2 afternoons working in the garden. By the time the week was over, the winter squash was in the ground, and the soil she had turned over had that special deep color of land that has been properly tended to, for the first time in a long while. On her last day, she fixed the latch on the back window, the same one she had climbed through on the night she first arrived. She fixed it, and did not say a word about it. Ethan found it that evening, testing it with his hand, hearing the clean, solid click of something that was finally secure, and he just stood there for a minute in the kitchen, holding the window shut. She came to say her goodbyes the morning she was to leave. He was mending a fence by the corral. She had her travel bag with her, and the horse Tom Briggs had lent her for the journey. And she stood there in the yard with that same quality she had on the night she arrived. Composed and self-contained, carrying more weight than anyone could see on the surface. But it was different now. When she first came, she was carrying nothing but loss. What she carried now was harder to put a name on, but it had a direction. It was aimed at something better. The squash needs watering every 2 days, she told him. Not every day, every 2. I know how to water a squash patch, he said. You have not watered a single thing in 3 years, she reminded him. He could not argue with that. Every 2 days, he agreed. She adjusted the bag tied to her saddle. Then she turned to look at him, straight on, with the same unguarded expression he had only seen once or twice before, in Aldridge's office and in the dark alley beside the courthouse. Ethan, she said, when I came here, I had run out of road. She paused. I want you to understand that what you did, what you chose to do, it was no small thing. For my father, and for Jed, and for all of them. Her voice was steady, but only just. You did not have to choose to help at all. I know, he said. I am saying thank you, she said, making her words plain so there could be no mistake. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Just come back, he said. That is all I'm asking. She met his gaze and held it. I will come back, she promised. She rode out then. He stood in the yard and watched her go, watched until she was past the east fence line and the dust had all settled, until the morning was completely still and quiet all around him. Then he turned, went to the barn, picked up the watering bucket, and carried it out to the garden. She came back 6 weeks later. He knew it was her long before he could make out the rider clearly. He knew by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the particular way the rider sat in the saddle. That straight-backed, forward-leaning way of someone riding with a purpose. He was checking the fence on the north side of the property when she rode in. He walked back across the yard as she dismounted, tied up her horse, and turned to face him. She looked different. Not lighter, exactly. Nothing about what had happened was light. But something that had been coiled tight inside of her for months, some deep-down bracing for the next blow, had finally let go. She stood there in the yard without that armor of readiness, and what was left behind was something open and clear. How is he? Ethan asked. He is alive, she said. It went better than I ever hoped. She took a breath. I sat down with him and I told him the whole story. His words don't come out right anymore, but he understood me. I know he did because he took my hand and just held on for the better part of an hour. She kept her voice even, but you could tell it took something out of her. The legal challenge is officially in. Aldridge got all his papers filed. The judge they gave us this time is a different one from the fellow who ruled against us before. A quiet moment passed. It is going to take a while, but things are finally moving, Ethan said. Yes, she agreed. Finally. Her eyes scanned the yard, taking in the fence line, the corral, and the south wall of the barn where the new shingles he nailed up last week looked so new against the weathered planks. She glanced at the garden, and you could see the squash vines creeping low to the ground, spreading out just the way she knew they would. You've been watering it every 2 days, she stated. I told you I would, he answered. A simple, honest feeling passed over her face. She reached into her satchel, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, and offered it to him. He took it and unfolded it. It was a drawing, a simple pencil sketch of an orchard, the kind a person draws from a memory deep in their heart. 4 trees standing in a row, drawn with a rough hand, but with the kind of accuracy that only comes from a picture held in the mind for years. Each tree had its own shape, and the distance between them was captured perfectly. I had my father draw it for me, she explained. He cannot write anymore, but his hands can still make a picture. This is how the apple trees looked right after my mother put them in the ground. She let that hang in the air for a second. I figured if we're going to plant more up by your North Creek, you ought to see what a proper orchard is supposed to look like at the start. Ethan stared at the drawing for a good long while. He looked at the 4 little trees, sketched by a sick man's hand from 30 years of looking back. He saw the space between them, the deliberate gap that you need for things to grow right. "We will head up there tomorrow," he said. "To the creek. We will see what Clara's trees are thirsty for." "Tomorrow," she said. "Yes." He folded the paper with care and tucked it into his shirt pocket right over his heart. She went to check on her horse. He walked back to the fence line, and the whole ranch seemed to breathe easier around them, like a place that knows the right folks are finally doing the work. Slow and sure, building something that would last. That evening she made supper. She did not ask. She did not say a word about it. He just walked in from the barn, and the aroma hit him, just like it had on that very first night. The scent of warm bread, a rich stew simmering on the stove, the unmistakable feeling of a real home that had been cold and empty for far too long. And there was Lydia, setting 2 plates on the table, same as that first night. Only this time it felt completely different. This time, it did not feel like a surprise or a test or some cautious deal being made between 2 strangers. It felt like coming home. He took his seat. She sat in the chair across from him. The warm glow of the lamp flickered between them. The kitchen was filled with the kind of silence that only comes when a room is full of all the right things. After some time, she spoke without looking up from her meal. "The garden should be ready to harvest in about 3 weeks. "I know," he said. "We ought to start thinking on the south pasture after that," she said. "Get it ready for spring." "I have been thinking on it," he said. She finally looked up at him. "And I figure it can handle about 30 head, he continued, "if we get the right kind of grass planted and manage the water right." She held his gaze for a long moment, and the look she gave him, so direct and warm and open, carried the whole quiet story of a week spent mending fences, of a morning in a courthouse, of 6 weeks of holding their breath, and of a drawing of 4 little trees tucked safely in his pocket. It was the truest thing he had seen in more years than he could rightly count. "30 is a good number," she said softly. "It is a good start," he replied. They returned to their meal. Outside, the garden grew quietly in the night. Up by the North Creek, the apple trees held tight to the dry earth with their roots and waited for the sun. The fences stood tall and straight along the edges of his land, and the lamp in the window of Ethan Cole's house burned just as it had the night he came home to find a stranger sitting at his table. It was a warm, steady light you could see from a long way off. Only now, it was burning for 2. And Ethan Cole, a man who had spent 3 years making sure every light in his house stayed dark, finally understood the single bravest thing a broken man can ever do. It is to let someone show him where the warmth had gone and then choose, with both his eyes wide open, to let the light back in for good. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.